Welcome to Excess Returns, where we focus on what works over the long term in the markets. Join us as we talk about the strategies and tactics that can help you become a better long-term investor.
Justin Carbonell and Jack Forehand are principals at Validia Capital Management. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Validia Capital. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of Validia Capital.
Hey guys, this is Justin. In this episode of Excess Returns, Jack and I discuss rebalancing, the importance of rebalancing, how rebalancing can help add to your returns, ideas on how and when to rebalance, and more. As Jack points out, rebalancing is one of those simple but highly important things in investing that we should be paying attention to over time. As always, thank you for listening. Please enjoy this quick discussion around rebalancing. All right, today we're going to talk about the concept of rebalancing one's portfolio and sort of what goes into that. And Jack, you wrote an article this week on this idea, and I think this, a lot of times investors hear about rebalancing and it sort of gets glossed over, but there's a lot of important things I think that should be thought about when rebalancing one's stock portfolio or even your overall, let's say, portfolio in terms of different asset classes. But before we get into that, Jack, I thought you did want to mention one thing. We were talking before the podcast, so I'll let you start with that, and then we'll kind of get into the core topic here.
No, I just want to say congratulations on the 100th episode. We had, it's amazing we've made it all the way to 100 episodes. I didn't think, when we started this that we probably had any shot. So it's great that we were able to pull it off. Yeah,
well, thank you. Congrats to you too. Well, I think given the way the Arnott interview is trending and how that's doing well, maybe you should be doing these on your own from now.
You certainly add a lot, but also that sort of goes to show the way this whole thing works. It never goes as smoothly as you thought. We have this great idea, right? We're going to have our 100th episode. We got a great guest in Rob Arnott, and then we try to log on and there's technical issues. And so we obviously couldn't have our 100th episode be something that we both weren't on, because we both have been on every episode, that we've done. So it would have been dumb to try to do an episode that I'm just doing an interview as our 100th episode. So it just goes to show, we've had to pivot a lot, and, we made it work. So we did a compilation for our 100th episode of our favorite interviews instead of having Rob. But I really enjoyed interviewing Rob. I was obviously quite nervous at the last second, you not being on and me having to figure it out.
Yeah, you did great. I think one of the things that we sort of focused on or highlighted it in that 100th episode is actually how much we've learned throughout this process. Not only do these discussions that we have amongst ourselves sort of force us to, talk through these investing concepts, but these guests that we've had on have been really some of the most knowledgeable, smartest people. And some of these guests, they're not necessarily the most popular or most followed people. Thinking of someone like Kai Wu, I think he was on our podcast first before everyone else, but he's brilliant when it comes to, disruptive companies and machine learning and stuff like that. So anyways, it's just been really great to get to learn about some of these people and their expertise.
Yeah, and just before we get into rebalancing, the best part for me has been, the one thing I don't like doing in interviews is where we have to sort of ask questions where we already know the answers, and we've been able to not do that a lot. I mean, there's been a lot of times while we're sitting here interviewing somebody, and I'm actually learning something I didn't know. And that's been really cool, is the fact that we've learned a lot ourselves from the process.
Yeah, so anyway, so to get into sort of this rebalancing premium is, I think, what you called it in the article. Maybe just to start, if you want to kind of intro this, and then we'll get into some of the more the other pieces of what we want to discuss.
Yeah, all of us tend to do, whatever it takes to try to generate excess returns over the market. We'll create these crazy complicated strategies. We'll suffer, years of pain and value stocks to try to do it. And sometimes we miss the most obvious, easy things that you can use to generate a premium. And rebalancing is one of those examples. Nobody's that excited to talk about rebalancing. It may not be the most interesting topic, but it makes a huge difference. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to just talk about rebalancing and talk about why it works and maybe some of the reasons people don't totally understand why it works. And then I went through some examples in the article too to show how you can actually increase your returns by properly rebalancing your portfolio.
Yeah, so why don't you work through that tail risk example, because I think that's a good one that you outlined in the article.
Yeah, so I used, most investors obviously don't hold tail risk funds, and most investors probably shouldn't hold tail risk funds, but it's a perfect example. The one reason I wanted to use it in the article is the perfect example of how rebalancing can help you. So what I did in the article is I said, let's say you have a portfolio, you have your stock and bond portfolio, and you add a very small position to a tail risk fund. Well, if you look at the long-term returns of those specific funds, you would say stocks, let's say, have a 10% long-term return. Bonds, whatever it is, going forward, they're going to be lower. But whatever it is, let's say you get your 4 or 5% from bonds. And the tail risk fund would actually have, typically, a tail risk fund is insurance. You're paying for insurance that if the market goes down a lot, I'm going to make a lot of money. So typically insurance costs money and a tail risk fund costs money. So typically they have a negative return over time. But you can take that tail risk fund and you can add it to a stock and bond portfolio and you can increase your return over time, even though it has a negative return. And the reason for that, we basically saw the reason for that in the coronavirus crisis. The reason is because that fund is paying out. So it's very negatively correlated with stocks. And so when your stocks are doing the worst, that fund is doing the best. And so many of those tail risk funds were up, 4, 5, 6, 7 times your money during the crisis. And so what happens is, this is where the benefits of rebalancing come in. Because if you have something like that that's going up when stocks are going down, and you can continue to add money systematically to stocks at lows, so when everybody else doesn't have money because they're losing money in their stocks, you have something that's going up that allows you to continue to rebalance into stocks systematically. That can actually increase your return, even though over the long term that fund has a negative return. And that's something I think people miss a lot, is that if you take the weighted average return of everything in your portfolio, that's not necessarily your return. You can actually increase that by rebalancing. So you can return more than the weighted average of the asset classes you hold by properly rebalancing your portfolio.
Right. Another example you gave in the article is that research from Adam Butler from Resolve Asset Management, who we've had on the podcast. And he had a paper titled The Rebalancing Premium in Risk Parity Portfolios. And basically what he showed is he used the permanent portfolio, which if people don't know what the permanent portfolio is, it basically holds 4 different asset classes: stocks, gold, short-term bonds, and long-term bonds. And then what he showed in this paper is that by rebalancing among those asset classes over different time periods, you can actually get what he calls a rebalancing premium, which increases the overall return of the portfolio above and beyond, like you said, the weighted compound return of those asset classes. And in his paper and in the article you pointed out, it increases the return by about 1.2% per year in terms of this rebalancing premium that is harvested by rebalancing more often to take advantage of what you're sort of talking about here.
Yeah, and just to define rebalancing premium, that basically what I said before is what he's talking about. So if you take each asset you have and you multiply its weight in your portfolio by its return, that will give you the return, sort of an overall return for your portfolio. But you can exceed that return by rebalancing, and the amount you exceed it by is effectively what's called the rebalancing premium. And so he found that just holding the portfolio of bonds, stocks, and gold generated X return, but rebalancing that portfolio added another 1.2% a year, which is a lot. When those of us who are looking for factors, that increase our returns, if you can increase your return by 1.2% a year, that's really good. So that's a lot, and he found you can do that just by rebalancing. So that's more of a real world example. Most people aren't holding tail risk funds. I just use that extreme example to try to show the principle, but that's a real world example of how, and it works with stocks and bonds too. It doesn't have to be gold in there, because most people aren't going to hold that much gold. It works in all cases. So just rebalancing your portfolio can enhance your returns over time is the principle we're trying to talk about.
Now, what I think a lot of investors do is they may use the start of the year to rebalance. So it's like a calendar, year thing. So it's, the new year comes, the first week of the new year. If somebody has a target allocation, they may rebalance back to that. That's a good sort of behavior habit if you can remember to do it. A lot of investors, though, to your point, sort of miss that. They just let these asset classes drift and, don't think about the importance of rebalancing. But we want to kind of talk about the different, triggers that may cause a rebalance or may prompt a rebalance, which one is obviously on a set schedule, like we're talking about. You could do it at the beginning of the year, once every 6 months or something like that. I mean, you have to be a little bit careful about tax implications if it's taxable money. But then there's another way, which is maybe some type of band or threshold type of triggering event.
Yeah, so what you talked about is probably not the right way to do it, but it's better than the worst case. So the worst case is I have no system. I'm just going to look at it myself and I'm going to decide, all right, today I'm going to rebalance. That your emotions, your biases play too much of a role in that. So trying to do that is probably the worst case scenario. And then doing it once a year, like you said, is probably not enough. But there's really 2 questions you have to answer here. One is, how often am I going to do it? if I'm going to do it systematically. And the other is, am I going to have some other system that if outside of my regularly scheduled rebalancing, something happens in the market that might dictate a rebalancing, am I going to have some sort of bands? So for instance, if my target to an asset class is 20%, am I going to say if it gets below 15 or if it gets above 25, I'm going to trigger an automatic rebalance? And I think, it totally depends. The right answer to that totally depends on every person, because some accounts are taxable, and obviously taxable accounts you may want to rebalance less. And everyone has different asset classes that have different correlations with each other. There are a lot of factors that go into that. So there's no right answer. I mean, I think the way we generally tend to do it is a little bit of a combination of both, is have sort of a regularly scheduled, maybe like a quarterly type rebalancing, but also have something in there that allows for something like the coronavirus. Because if you timed your rebalancing, the coronavirus is a great example, because if you were rebalancing your portfolio once a year and you rebalanced it in January, well, you missed all the benefit of the coronavirus situation, because you took the entire decline and your stocks went back up, but you weren't buying. You weren't buying during the decline. You had already rebalanced for the year. And so that's the type of thing you want to avoid. And that's also, we're going to sort of talk about the when of rebalancing. And that's something that Corey Hofstein's done a lot of work around and is also important, which is if you are going to have a set schedule to rebalance, like let's say you're going to rebalance once a year, you're going to rebalance your portfolio once a year, you don't have to necessarily do the whole portfolio at once. So you can treat your portfolio as 12 different portfolios. You could say, on 1/12 of my portfolio, I'm going to rebalance every January. 1/12, I'm going to rebalance every February. 1/12, I'm going to rebalance every March. And that allows you to get around that problem I just talked about, which is that you just happen to have bad luck and you happen to rebalance right before, an event like that, and you don't get an opportunity to rebalance during it. So that's another thing you can do, is you can sort of say, I'm only going to rebalance my portfolio once a year, but I'm going to treat it as 12 portfolios and rebalance each one of them once a month.
I guess it's not, I'm trying to differentiate or distinguish here between like rebalancing and factor timing. I think for me personally, I may have been a little bit more timing things during the coronavirus last year with rebalancing my own portfolio, getting exposure to certain strategies that we ran that had different types of exposures because of like the valuation spread. I mean, I was rebalancing my portfolio, but I was effectively timing, I guess, a little bit as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a timing element to this. I mean, by rebalancing, you're playing on mean reversion. Obviously, if you had, 3 assets in your portfolio and one always, went up more than the other ones, then there would be no reason to rebalance. But you're playing on the fact that eventually there'll be mean reversion. But like we were talking about before we started filming, the other thing here is momentum does work in asset classes. So the asset classes that do well sort of over the intermediate term can tend to continue doing well. And so rebalancing too much can be a problem. It can be a problem for taxable accounts, but it can also be a problem. You might be able to get some benefit from momentum by not constantly bringing, for instance, if stocks are having a good run, by not just constantly bringing them back to their target. You can let them run some, but you don't want to let them run, forever, because at a certain point that momentum signal is not there anymore, and you want to sort of bet on mean reversion. So it's a balance. It's very hard to get it perfect, but you don't have to get it perfect, and that's one of the things like a lot of the research on rebalancing has shown. You don't have to time the bottoms in these asset classes to get rebalancing right. You just have to have a systematic process that's making the right decisions over time, and over time that will add to your return, although you certainly won't call the coronavirus bottom, because nobody can do that.
One of the things, just going back to the permanent portfolio for a second, I know that with the version that we run, we allow the asset classes to drift a certain percentage, and then after that there's a rebalancing that takes place to try to bring them back, to try to take advantage of this concept of, mean reversion basically among the asset classes.
That's right. We tend to use a sort of a combination of a scheduled approach, but also that band approach, because especially there's been some research that the market's speeding up here. I think there's definitely an argument to say if we get one of these crazy one-off events, you want to be, when you get a 35% decline in stocks over the period of whatever it was, 6 weeks or whatever it was, you want to be rebalancing during that. So you want to have flexibility to do that, but you also don't want to be, me and you having a conversation and saying, oh, should we rebalance? Should we not rebalance? You want to have a systematic process that says, all right, we've had this major event. My target weights have strayed enough. Rebalance back in. And so that's what we try to do. We try to use a combination of a scheduled approach, but also an approach that says if we do have one of these more extreme one-off events, we'll rebalance back during those.
And 2 other real-world sort of examples that I can think of is, when working with investors that are at or nearing retirement, there's certainly an important discussion around risk and return and goals and sort of rebalancing the portfolio. I mean, we do that. And then also another example is with some strategies that have done extremely well, investors may want to sort of allocate out of that and maybe into other strategies that haven't done as well, or where there's more relative value. Those are like real world actual examples of working with investors that I can think of, where we're kind of blending a little bit of rebalancing sort of happening, in those actions.
And your first one was a perfect example, because it's we don't exist in a vacuum. So all of us have certain situations in our lives where things change, and we all know that around retirement, your level of risk you can tolerate is actually, although some people think, well, I have a 30-year time frame, I should have the most risk, because of sequence of returns risk, you probably should be lowering risk, around retirement. So that could be a situation where I might have a preset rebalancing schedule, but I know I'm getting around retirement, so I'm going to do a one-off rebalancing here due to something in my own situation. So it's not as if everybody can have the same system. Everybody's got to take into account their own situation, where they are in life, where they are relative to retirement, and make a decision, that's right for them.
Is that sequence risk also the same thing as timing luck? I mean, are those two things the same, or are they different?
No, they're different. So
Okay.
Sequence of returns risk is the risk that you'll have a major loss, right at or around retirement, and that because you're withdrawing money, you won't be able to recover it.
Right.
Timing luck is just the risk that's what Corey's talked about. That's just the risk that I'll rebalance my portfolio at the wrong time and I'll get unlucky.
Okay.
So an example is like that I'm rebalancing once a year, and I rebalance in January before the coronavirus, and I don't get to rebalance in when stocks are down. That's basically timing luck. Is that I'm just by purpose of luck, I'll rebalance at the wrong time.
So I think with rebalancing, it really comes down to, understanding its importance, which hopefully we've been able to articulate today. And then, trying to set up, within reason, sort of these systems, these procedures, maybe some rules where you are rebalancing your portfolio, you're taking advantage of buying into things or shifting into things when maybe asset classes are down, so you can get maybe a better return over time. But also understanding, like your point, Jack, is that these things don't exist in a vacuum, and so everyone's different in how they might want to try and implement this. But I think hopefully these are some ideas and some thoughts that will help people understand and maybe better rebalance their portfolios over time.
Yeah, and just to close, I think the major point here is sometimes the simplest things in investing are the most important. And you can sit there and develop your 27-factor strategy to try to get a little bit more excess return over the market. But if you're going to do that, make sure you're doing the simple things right first. Make sure you're actually rebalancing your portfolio properly. You have a systematic system, and it makes sense for you. So sometimes just these simple things are more important, and we get trapped in these complicated things, when we don't need to.
All right. So thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Hi guys, this is Justin again. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Excess Returns. You can follow Jack on Twitter at @PracticalQuant and follow me on Twitter at JJCarbonell. If you found this discussion interesting and valuable, please subscribe in either iTunes or on YouTube, or leave a review or a comment. We appreciate it.